So I assume you're as depressed as I am by that? But I think there's also, more than depression, there's possibility. And maybe, this is not on my list of questions, you could talk about that a little.
Well, the possibility that I have entertained and have gotten nowhere with is the possible collaboration between progressives and principled conservatives on matters related to foreign policy.
It's you and me.
It's you and me. With a couple of friends, we were pitching the idea to sort of touch off this notion of a left-right foreign policy coalition. We tried to sell the editors of The Nation magazine, which I think is the most important magazine on the progressive side, and the American Conservative, which is a far smaller circulation, but is the closest thing to a serious conservative magazine. Tried to persuade the editors to agree to a combined issue, an issue of an oversized issue that would say on the cover, Nation, American Conservative, some kind of a cover illustration making the effect that there is potential for collaboration. And we failed. We failed because we couldn't raise enough money, and we failed because we couldn't get the editors of the magazine to, they didn't say this is a stupid idea, but they were not willing to set aside reservations and fully buy into it. So that was a failure, but nonetheless, I think that there is a possibility for finding common ground on foreign policy issues, and that common ground can then provide an alternative to what we hear from the militarism we hear from the mainstream of the Democratic Party and the militarism that we see in the mainstream of the Republican Party.
Okay, so we all write into The Nation and the American Conservative. We start there and try and get that issue out.
Well,
I think that would be terrific. So now I have some questions that I thought of and you don't know yet what they are. I want to start with your recent interview in Pasatiempo. You said there, quote, "We live in a society in which the majority of the American people are persuaded that we have the greatest military the world has ever seen. They believe that if properly prepared, the US military can do anything," end quote. So what's wrong with that belief? Isn't the American military the greatest, or anyhow the biggest, strongest, best equipped military the world has ever seen? Why can't it do anything?
Well, it is the greatest, most capable, best funded. And I think the issue relates to the nature of war itself. That war is an enterprise fraught with uncertainties. It is an undertaking that throughout history, time and again, has yielded consequences other than those that the proponents of war had come to expect. I myself am, although I have enormous regard for pacifists, I'm not a pacifist, but I have come to believe that the utility of force is limited to a pretty narrow range of circumstances. And quite frankly, it works best when you are defending that which your people, your nation values most, to the extent that force is being employed to force change. That's when I think we get in trouble, and that has been the principal role of the United States military in the post-Cold War era. We're trying to make things right in our own view, and time and again, that simply hasn't worked.
Well, make things right so long as they agree with us.
That's right. Make things right in our view.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one of the themes you've stressed recently in your writing is the increasing separation between state and society. I wonder if you could say a little more what you mean by that and how it might be possible to bring the two into closer alignment. And also, when has it ever been any different? I mean, Randolph Bourne talked not about war as the health of society, but war as the health of the state.
And Bourne was right. I think there's no question that.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. That said, there will be times, the time should be infrequent, when there is a need to go to war. And it seems to me that when those times arrive, we are best served, especially in a democracy, with approaching that war by relying on citizen soldiers. Mm-hmm. You and I may disagree on this, but
No, we don't.
No, well, but
I'll wait.
Yeah,
Maybe we do.
but my own broad interpretation of U.S. military history is one that recalls that, at least until the end of World War II, the sort of default view of the American people was to view military power and military institutions with great skepticism. We were, in many respects, an anti-military people. The founders had warned against the dangers of having a standing army. That doesn't mean we were a peaceful people. We were actually rather belligerent. And when the nation, or the nation's leaders, got themselves in a belligerent mood, for example, in 1846, when President Polk decided he had a yearning to go take New Mexico along with California and Texas, we raised up a great army of citizen soldiers to go do the deed. And we did the deed, and once we had taken what we wanted, that citizen army dissipated and went away. Mm-hmm. That's the recurring pattern in U.S. military history. That's what we did that's what we had done in 1812. That's what we did in 1846. What we did in 1861. We did it in 1898. We did it in 1917. And indeed, we did it when we began to mobilize for World War II in 1940. Citizen soldiers bore the brunt of major American wars. For the most part, in that entire period, the entity called the United States Army that I served in, the regular army, had virtually no significant war-waging capability. That changes with the onset of the Cold War.
Yeah.
The United States commits itself to maintaining very significant military power on a standing basis, but even until Vietnam, it did so in a way that preserved the essence of the tradition of the citizen soldier. That tradition then collapses in Vietnam. It collapses in Vietnam as a result of the divisions that the Vietnam War induces. Richard Nixon acknowledged those divisions, acknowledges the collapse of the tradition by declaring that henceforth we're going to rely on an all-volunteer force, which means a professional military, not a citizen military. Most Americans applauded that decision, particularly those who were subject to the draft, because they were now off the hook. And indeed, through the 1980s and the 1990s, the all-volunteer force, this reliance on a professional military, seemed like a pretty good deal. We had what seemed to be an effective military, and the rest of us had no particular obligations or responsibility except to applaud. It's only, I think, since 9/11, and particularly since the initiation of the Iraq War of 2003, that it's begun to dawn on people that reliance on professional soldiers has a downside. And the biggest downside is that we, the people, essentially have forfeited any say over what our soldiers are sent to do. The creation of the professional military has given the state a greater free hand in deciding when, where, and how to wage war. But the second thing that we've discovered is, guess what? Even though we do have the world's greatest military, it doesn't win. The citizen military used to win. The world's greatest military doesn't. And so we find ourselves in this predicament of wars that go on and on and on and on fruitless wars, a sort of vague recognition on the part of the American public that, I don't know, it doesn't seem to be working, and yet very few levers that can be applied to bring about change. So I think the answer is we need to rethink the basis of the American military system. We need to ask ourselves whether or not this standing army that is our military, does that really serve the interests of the United States of America? Does it even serve the interests of the military itself?
Right.
Now the generals are happy with this system.
All of them?
I think most of them. I mean, when I was a young officer in Vietnam and right after, we still had draft. It's really a pain. You know, the first sergeant has to work real hard to keep draftees in line. It's a lot easier for the first sergeant and the company commander if you have volunteers. That's when I say the generals like it, because it makes things simpler. Mm-hmm. But I've come to the conclusion that it's actually not in the interests of our country.
I don't know why you thought we disagree. We agree about a lot of that. I mean, one of the first things Charlie Rangel did with the Iraq War was say, bring back the draft as a way of getting out of that war.
Others, and yes, he is an example of one politician who I think gets that, but where has that initiative gone?
Not very far.
Yeah.
Let's talk before it's too late about Obama's last-minute foreign policy moves, which in my view are mostly riffs on earlier policies. Most significantly, he has expanded the power of the executive to target suspected terrorists worldwide through an increase in the independence, really, of the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, and the executive ability to just tell it to go where he wants, or she, or she, it could have been, wants it to go.
And she would have too, by the way.
Oh, absolutely. No, absolutely. So in your view of this, and while I'm at it, what's your view of this, and while I'm at it, Obama's use of drones, and what does it portend for the future?
Well, I invite your attention to my article that was just posted online for the Nation magazine, which is my assessment of Obama's foreign policy legacy, so that you won't have to read it.
You should read it. I've read it.
In a nutshell, it's this. Obama figured out that invading and occupying countries with expectations of changing them in ways congenial to our interests wasn't working, costly, needed to find something else. And so he made his own effort along those lines in his surge in Afghanistan in roughly 2010. But having learned that lesson, he then continued to wage the so-called global war on terrorism, but to adapt different means that reduced cost to us, airstrikes, drones, special operations forces, with very little indication that he was any more effective than George W. Bush had been. So I think you have to give him fairly low marks, not as low as George W. Bush, who gets the lowest, but you know, I think in his management of wars, President Obama probably gets a C-. That said, I think that there is considerable likelihood that Obama's longer-term legacy as a statesman will turn out to be more positive, because he's put some things into play, in motion, that if they are permitted to come to fruition, big if with Trump, but if they are permitted to come to fruition, actually may yield some pretty positive outcomes. Examples: the Paris climate deal. I mean,
where's wood? Let's knock wood on that one.
Pardon?
We should knock wood on that one.
Well, anyhow. Yeah, no, I mean, I agree, but I think the Iran nuclear deal. Right. I mean, you know, the big caveat: will such initiatives survive in the Trump administration? And we can't say yet. I'm not entirely convinced that Trump's going to be jettisoning these things right away. If they survive, and depending how events play out, 10 years from now, we might view those initiatives undertaken by Obama, but not brought to fruition,
Right.
as significant achievements. So, I mean, the bottom line is only time will tell, I think.
Yeah. You know what's really strange, though, Andrew? I don't know if you agree, but one administration makes an agreement, and the next administration abrogates it. Who's going to negotiate with us, ever? They can't count on it lasting more than a total of 8 years.
Oh, I mean, I think with regard to the Iran nuclear deal, that's going to,
It's
that's
really-
going to be one of the things that Trump is going to, if he's got any sense at all, he would have to reflect on a little bit before he acts.
Right.
Because that's not a bilateral agreement. It's an agreement between the permanent five
Exactly.
powers of the UN National Security Council and the Germans and Iran. So if we just blithely say, we quit, we're out, you're right. Why would anybody then deal with the United States? And somebody who views himself as a deal maker would probably have to take that into consideration.
Well, I hope so. This is one I've been struggling with too. I don't know if you share my impression that most historians of U.S. foreign policy hesitate to write critically, as you have done, about the relationship between American policies in the Middle East and those of Israel. I mean, they can be totally opposed to American policy, but they tread lightly. In the book that you've just published, which I urge you all to purchase immediately and read without putting down, you've written of the Israelification of American foreign policy. I don't know any others in our field who have done so, no matter how stringently they might criticize Israeli foreign policy as such. And while we're in the neighborhood, I wonder how you explain American support for Saudi policies, which you mentioned in your talk, and Yemen in particular. I mean, the destruction of Yemen, which was reported on very well, actually, by NPR this evening, but is usually not mentioned in the same breath as, say, East Aleppo. I wonder if you can talk about that for a while. The link between Saudi Arabia and Israel, the United States and Saudi and Israel.
Well, when I use the term Israelification of U.S. policy, what I was referring to is the U.S. military embracing methods that are pioneered to a considerable extent by the State of Israel. And preemption, preventive attack, is a good example of that. From the Israeli perspective of Israeli security requirements, preemption, you can make a case that it's a necessity. But I don't believe you can actually make that case with regard to the United States of America, which is one whole hell of a lot bigger and is insulated by a couple of vast oceans. But we have moved toward adopting these methods in a way that I think are pernicious. With regard to Yemen, I mean, the real answer is beats the hell out of me. The only argument I've heard that makes a modicum of sense is that Obama, in the wake of the Iran nuclear deal, Obama has seen the need to placate the Saudis, to reassure the Saudis that we are not abandoning them in favor of Iran, and that providing this support for the Saudi war in Yemen is one way of doing that. So we refuel their aircraft, we provide targeting data, we sell them all the weapons they want, and that, you know, if you buy this argument, that helps to prevent any further undermining of the Iran nuclear deal. I'm not saying I buy that, but that's the only argument I've heard that seems plausible.
Yeah. Well, I have time for two more quick questions for you. Last Saturday, Tom Ricks wrote an op-ed praising the choice of General James Mattis as Secretary of Defense. In the course of his short but nevertheless meandering column, in my view, Ricks praised Mattis as, quote, a strong counterweight to some of those around Mr. Trump who hold isolationist or pro-Putin views, end quote. So what's your view? We can't read minds, but what do you think Rick's meant by isolationist views? Are they a danger? And while we're at it, what about Putin? Is leaning to his side a danger?
Well, let me talk a little bit about I mean, it's very striking. We now have 3 very senior military officers in 3 critical positions.
Right.
Defense Secretary, National Security Advisor, Homeland Security. And one of the things I like to do is to, this is part of my evangelization. I always want to indicate to people that I'm a Catholic in the course of a discussion.
I was going to say, but...
And I was thinking to myself earlier today, I said, as a Catholic, would I want to have cardinal archbishops as Defense Secretary, National Security Advisor, and Secretary of Homeland Security? And I said to myself, as a practicing Catholic, hell no. And why not? Because people who spend so much of their lives within these all-encompassing institutions doesn't make them bad people, doesn't make them a bunch of automatons who all think alike, but nonetheless, they are shaped by the values that prevail in that institution. And I think that is true in spades in the military. I think that probably General Mattis is I know he's highly respected. He may be basically of sound mind and body. I think General Flynn is a lunatic. But regardless of personal qualities, we don't want to have, as a democracy, we don't want to have multiple positions at the top of the national security apparatus filled by people who've spent so much of their life in the military.
Okay, last question. Do you think there will ever be a day when no American president will have to swear allegiance to American exceptionalism and its duty to lead? Obama, for example, at some point said, quote, "I believe in American exceptionalism with every fiber of my being." A sentence so mindless to come from such a mindful man that I still can't get over it. So you got 2 minutes.
Well, I despair that we will ever.
Yeah, me too.
I think that the foundational document that eloquently defines our relationship to the world at large is John Winthrop's sermon of 1630. And if you haven't read it, you need to read it. So here's John Winthrop. He and his little company of people on the good ship Arbella are about to come ashore to found what will become the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he says, wait a second. You know, before we get into little boats, let's stop and talk about what we are about to do. And he says, you and I, we are in covenant with God. And we have been chosen by God to perform his work, to be as a city upon a hill, to transform the world and bring the world into agreement with our beliefs and our convictions. And I think that notion has come to be so deeply embedded in our collective psyche that I don't know how we're ever going to recognize it for, quite frankly, the blasphemous notion that it is. Because we do continue to believe that we are the chosen people, even in a secular sense.
Right.
chosen by providence, chosen by history, chosen by something.
Yeah, but you know, Andy, there's one thing. I mean, there's one thing to be a city on a hill, which means that people look to you.
Well, that's true.
And there's another thing of coming
There you
down
go.
off the hill
'Cause
and making them into you.
You can defend Winthrop's view by saying, well, he
Sit
was
there.
arguing that we should be the exemplar.
Right.
And indeed, I think that until more or less, this is a historical simplification, to more or less 1898, that notion of achieving our mission by being an exemplar to the rest of the world tended to prevail. Since 1898, especially since the end of the Cold War,
Right.
being an exemplar is appeasement.
Right.
It's isolationism. It's not good enough. We are summoned to do more, and in responding to that summons, I'm afraid we've committed great mischief.
Well, we can hope for undoing it
We can.
and protesting it and
Yes.
resisting it, which
Yes.
is what we recommend to you.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy. That was great.
Thanks so much.